Okay, so we're here now for the fifth reading of the Economics at the End of a Delusion by Lyndon LaRouche. The previous presentations or the previous workshops that we've all been through will be links in the description box, so people can refer back to those. Just to be very summary, I'm not going to do a big recap, but the last reading session 2 weeks ago, we were introduced to the question of what sort of language are we utilizing when mapping out the universe that we were created into. Um, Obviously, there's different types of languages. Languages always have concepts at their root, at their heart, and mathematics is no exception. It is a consistent, self-contained language that has rooted assumptions built into it, as we've been looking at it various ways. We were introduced to the idea of Euclidean geometry and the mathematical shadows, aka mathematical formulas of the geometrical world that is created by somebody like a Euclid, which is again internally consistent. It is broad, but it is also flawed in a variety of very systematic ways that we've observed regarding blind assumptions. For example, the idea of the parallel postulate, that in this universe that Euclid would have us believe we live within, and that his language is supposed to map out or help us navigate through, it is presumed that space has certain characteristics, of which part of one of those primary characteristics is linearity, infinite linearity, and the idea that you could grow two parallel lines at perfect, um, let's say, perpendiculars, two perpendicular lines to another, meaning that they grow out from a third line at 90-degree angles that extend that way forever, maintaining that characteristic. Now, in the real universe, we've come to realize increasingly that space is not only not linear, it is not empty. It doesn't work that way. That even when you try to do something that is a perfectly straight thing, like using a laser beam, we've discovered that there is a curvature based upon the physical properties of the fields that are everywhere. We have electromagnetic fields. We have what appears to be things like planets with space separating them. But when you look at different filters of the electromagnetic spectrum, we realize that is actually fully saturated space. It's an ocean of saturated substance. Sorry, my internet's very bad. I think it's because everybody in the household right now is using the internet for some pretty heavy reasons, and so it's just not equipped to handle this weight. If it happens again, we might have to abort today's reading because Cynthia's. I heard her a little agitated that her internet also crapped out at the same moment that ours did, so she gets precedent in this case. Okay, so yeah, just to return back. So in short, the question of language, what sort of language we choose to use to map out the universe is very important. And if we use a language which has no correlation to the actual nature of the universe that we were created into and are trying to make sense of and act upon in a lawful way, then we are really in trouble. So we were introduced to the fallacy of cybernetics, information theory, promoted by certain followers of Bertrand Russell, like Norbert Wiener, John von Neumann, last reading, and how LaRouche at a young age grappled with their fallacies and came through that attempt to refute their idea of an entropic universe that is a closed system, how he came to a lot of his insights into the anti-entropic nature, both of the universe, but also specifically of human economies, and how it is through the ability for creative leaps of discoveries to happen that we have the power to translate said immaterial metaphysical ideas into new technologies, which allow us to access greater portions of the electromagnetic spectrum that can be then harnessed and utilized. Like you can't have microwaves unless you discover microwaves, right? And then you can have the technology of microwaves. You could use that for a variety of things, telecommunication, other things, but you have to discover the spectrum. Same thing for the periodic table, same thing for the isotopes. The more you discover, the more you have a power to utilize nature's gifts in a way that improves the lives of people and overcomes the limits to growth. Very simple, very elementary, but not commonly understood. It's been very obscured, especially in our modern day. So this is something that LaRouche has been trying to hammer at for about 5 decades, and it's a theme that comes back again and again. In this particular writing that we're going to look at today, we're going to be introduced to the question of now arts in a certain way, arts, poetry, literature, and morality. So I think it's going to be a pretty potent concept or set of concepts. I don't have an ability to download the PDF. I've tried now several times. It fails every time. So I'm going to ask Pascal. Are you still there, Pascal? Okay, I'm going to ask Declan. Declan.
Yeah.
So I'm going to make you. Have you ever used Zoom as a co-host?
Yeah, I can screen share. You want me to screen share?
Yeah. So I've just made you co-host. Would you go ahead and screen share that?
Okay. Let's see. Okay, do you see?
There we go.
Okay.
So we can scroll down now to page 24, I believe.
Okay.
It's there. It is.
It's page 27.
Oh, he's got it. He's got it. The role of art in economics and morals. Or do we didn't go further than that, did we, Quan?
No, no. It's
Yeah, we
the
just got
perfect
to
it's a place that we start today.
Oh, I see. Yeah, it's literally page 27 on the EIR, but it's page 24 of 66 of this PDF. So it's good. It's what we're looking at
Okay.
is just great. So for today, since I'm going to try to stay quiet, plus my throat still hurts a little bit too. We just need a reader. Who would like to be today's first reader? Ooh, that's very big. Hey, Jonathan, would you like to read?
Yes, I'm just trying to find it on my computer here. 1 second.
Well, you can't see it on this computer?
I can, but I'm not able to follow reading. I don't have that skill.
I could do it for a little while.
Pardon me, Sadomi?
I could do it for a little while. You know, I may have to leave early, but I could do it for a little while.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, and I'll come in after. Yeah, cool.
Okay. Consider the role of art in economics and morals. Consider for a moment, as part of the indictment of the charlatans of information theory, a commonplace, relevant illustration of the kind of socially expressed economic dysfunction which the popularization of information theory and related practices has introduced to the design and use of manufactured products. Look at the degeneration in the functional qualities of material, which so-called tech writers have inserted into the typical product description and use instructions accompanying the delivery of a manufactured product. Consider also a directly related pathology exhibited in the past decades, often disastrous, increasingly widespread substitution of benchmarking for competent design engineering. Then, after summarizing that case, contrast those indicated forms of cultural decadence to the qualities of communication which the classical English poet Percy, is it
I think it's Bish.
Bysshe Shelley identified as periods in history during which there is an increase of the power for imparting and receiving profound and impassioned conceptions respecting man and nature. It is readily shown that the effort to make a separation between matters of artistic composition and subjects, such as physical science and economics, reveals a moral impoverishment of the mind of the would-be scientist or economist. The included result of such an impoverishment will be, inevitably, a contribution to society's loss of economic potential. For example, of such a pathological influence, consider the following: relative simple quality of clinical evidence. During and immediately following World War II, there was a significant and expanding resort to dividing the work of the scientist and engineer who designed the product from the writing of those descriptions and instructions supplied, which were prepared for the use by persons who came to be known as tech writers. At the outset, the resulting damage was apparently minimal. The tech writers tended to show actual, conscience-stricken comprehension of the product they were describing. Over the years, especially with the introduction of the unconscionable fad called programmed learning, the always fragile functional relationship between the actual design of the product and the description by the tech writers became an increasingly troubled one. As it is said, the competent or relatively competent tech writers of the immediate post-war period into the 1950s took it from the top. In the instance of the information associated with the product of any reliable firm, the reader was usually given an overview of the subject being addressed and a sense of the relative functional relations among the sundry components and operations referenced in that report. Over time, the quality of tech writing became increasingly less coherent. The work product suggested something assembled from the snippets sent in from sundry places. The effect of this loss of coherence was that reading the finished, combined results suggested more and more the image of a collage of lines, each written by one of a scattered herd of separate writers, many of whom were apparently on poor speaking terms with one another. The end result has been often something akin to the recurring nightmare of the guilt-ridden nerd. This problem, which was merely symptomized by the case of the apparently disintegrating mind of the evolving species of tech writers, was aggravated cataclysmically in the extreme by three social factors. First, the accelerating degeneration in public and higher education over the course of recent 35 years. This is typified by the influence of the 1963 OECD report on education issued by the influential Malthusian Dr. Alexander King. Second, the disastrous effect of the post-1963 spread of the rock, drug, sex cultural paradigm shift in destroying the intellectual and related emotional mission orientations of dedication to competence among secondary and higher education graduates. Third, the past 30 years process of combining intentional ruin of the former leading sectors of U.S. family farming and deindustrialization of urban industry, reflecting rabid devotion to free trade in general and outsourcing most emphatically. The effects of these trends were aggravated by the introduction of related, novel, and extremely irrational notions of the nature of intellectual property rights. A recent novelty expressing the same pathological trend is the idea of the patenting of John Q. Citizen's genes. This has the smell of something invented by the notorious Dr. Mengele, or perhaps H.G. Wells's Dr. Moreau. Over approximately the recent decade, under the impact of the process called globalization, even the mission expected of the tech writer and of the users of the product have undergone an additional qualitative change for the worse, to the effect of continually aggravated spread and intensification of functional illiteracy. From the evidence now at hand, it is implied that the tech writer usually assumes that the reader should not attempt to understand the product, but that he should obey literally and more or less blindly the instructions supplied. Usually, the instructions themselves are incompetent in one degree or another. Implicitly, at least, the idea that the provider has a moral responsibility for being either coherent or that the instructions should be competent has been abandoned. The peddler of the heavily outsourced product shrugs off the complaint as if to say, don't blame me, I don't make the stuff, I only sell it. If the instructions don't work, accept the fact that things are tough all over. Can someone explain that a little more clearly? Like, I can't understand the connection between the tech writer and the actual information. Is it meaning we're getting too technical and less creative?
He's talking about the steps of decay, that once were much more organically. There used to be the two spheres of pure and applied knowledge used to be they used to dance together more organically many decades ago, and there's been a process of detachment, disassociation of the designer of new let's say machine tools, and the so you design something in your mind, but then you have to build it. And when you build it, it requires technicians to come up with, blueprints, outlines of the different parts that all have to work together in the machine, because the machine, depending on its complexity, has many different moving parts that have to work together. So there has to be something being communicated through the minds of every person along the every phase of the operation down to the assembly line. And that's become increasingly fragmented and diminished in quality on every regard. And he described the compartmentalization process as one bad slip, where,
Yes.
and I have a member of my family who works in AutoCAD, and they've told me this for many years, that they just work on a very tiny part. They're given a very specific thing that they have to work on every day. They don't know what the machine is that it does. They just have to work on that very specific part of a piston within an engine or something. But you've got, dozens of people working on different localized parts, and nobody really there gets to see what the whole is doing, even on such a simple thing. And he's now describing globalization, making that even worse. That was already bad, but now we have a process of, greater decay based on, first, the slide into like a loss of value, where people now think you can have a value over intellectual property that is so pervert, like, because it's good to have intellectual property, right? Gives you an incentive to be creative. Why not? That's great. But then they've expanded that so that you could own life. You could own seeds like Monsanto, or as he's saying, genes of animals, or even maybe humans. If you can just modify it in a laboratory, you can say, okay, it's my intellectual property, and make money off of that. And then he's going further, and he's making a comment of something I couldn't think of an example about, but I guess he's had bad experience of the lack of consideration over the instructions that are written on how to use a machine or a product, and the actual functionality of the machine product, that are not necessarily correlated. Now, I couldn't think of any examples where this has happened to me. So I don't know if anybody else has examples that LaRouche seems to feel strongly about in their world. I don't know.
Well, I think top secret. Those classified information.
I don't think he's talking about that. He's talking about more cheap stuff.
Yeah.
That is sold under globalization's, order.
There's one very current, if you like, reference that I can make, and that's to military quality. Been a lot of discussions of comparisons, if you like, between Russia, China, and America. What would happen in a war. One of the problems that American technology has is that it's made up of too many seemingly unrelated. And what I mean by unrelated is manufactured by different, companies, et cetera, all of which has to come together and work and be integrated for the end product. Let's say some of the planes that are not doing so well in the air at the moment, to come together. Whereas both China and Russia, essentially for most of that high-end military hardware, planes and ships, is all done in-house. So it's all integrated at almost every level.
Oh, interesting point. Very good.
What I found is like try to set up like a wireless light bulb, a switch on your phone, and oh my gosh, those things never pair. It drives me nuts.
Right.
But they always do it in the videos. In the YouTube videos, they always do it.
I've read Alana Freeland's Geoengineering Transhumanism. I don't think I've yet recovered from reading that book. Just knowing that there is so much going on out there is, disconcerting.
Well, I agree, though. On what Declan just said, it's true. Now that you're bringing it up, there are things that I've bought online. Sometimes a little product pops up when you're on social media and you're like, oh, that looks pretty interesting and really useful, and they sell it to you, with a really awesome looking video, and then you get the damn thing and it sucks or it doesn't work, and you're trying to like follow all the instructions. And I was thinking about a juicer. I bought a juicer and it looked great. Like it's like you just throw the lemon in and you get pure lemon juice, and that, according to the video, that sold me. And when you get it, it really doesn't work. I got maybe I would have done better just squeezing the lemon with my hand than I did with this stupid device. Anyway, yeah, cheap stuff from
Look, and
globalization.
I can give another reference here, but it's singular, and it's to do with music. The introduction of electronic products, for example, beginning in the 70s, coming out of Japan in particular, all of the instruction manuals came with this kind of Japanese English that just didn't make sense. Descriptive terms that would, you kind of knew what the part was. You had a name for it, but the Japanese English gave it a different name. So, oh my goodness, I can remember spending hours just trying to understand some basics from a manual that were just ridiculous.
Right.
For years and years and years and years and years, and I don't think it's corrected yet. Now it's just Chinese translations.
There we go. I think we're on the same page now as LaRouche. Oh, Susie, yes.
What was the title of this section when we first started reading?
It was,
To
Declan
do
was
with
scrolling up.
arts.
There you are.
Yeah, the role of art in economics is morals
Okay.
and morals.
We just need to make sure that we actually do bring that back in.
Well,
The
he will.
art and the poetry
Yep.
and the morality and the honor. When this section, when she first started reading it, it felt like where he was going was, like our parents, when they bought things, they would last for so long. I mean, even your toaster on your counter. And it would eventually start not working quite right. And your dad could take it apart and clean it and maybe replace a wire, and it would work for another 10 years. But now they're made from such cheap components. There is no art to it. There's no honor to it. It's just everything is as cheap as possible. Just feeding into this whole consumerism thing. There is no value in the system anymore.
That's an excellent insight, Susie.
And
Yeah. Control
then
them.
when he
Controlled
started
obsolescence.
talking about, I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
planned obsolescence, yeah.
And then when he started talking about the tech manuals and all the other stuff in the last couple of paragraphs, you're just supposed to know your little cog in the machine and keep being your little cog in the machine. And you're not supposed to understand the big picture. And that's your closed system crap.
Yeah.
That we need to get rid of.
Yeah, exactly. Very good.
Now I'm going to hush.
Good point. No, that was an excellent contribution. Very good point. I think you zeroed in on exactly the point that LaRouche wanted people to hold in mind. That's right.
Yeah, throw away. That's what we live in.
I mean, these are all reflections of the values of your society. Every little element, if a product is designed to self-implode, or a seed that you create is genetically wired to commit suicide so that the farmer is forced to buy more with a special type of fertilizer, like the only type of pesticide that will allow it to spring forth life. Your society, that's a sign that your society is moving in a very bad direction versus a society that actually creates products for the purpose of health, nutrition, and longevity. Very different type of society.
Or being pushed in that direction by Rockefeller interests.
Well, exactly, yeah.
Good point, Matt. If I could add, on planned obsolescence, the immorality of it is presented as in a moral form that is in the best interest of the consumer, that you have these standards and so forth, that it would be beneficial to the end user. It is presented with that moral taste. but the immoral side of it is that it is designed for more profiteering and driving consumerism, planned obsolescence.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, I guess I should go on.
Sure.
Yeah. Consider the case of problems created by the outsourcing of sub-assemblies. That the latter have often been assembled from other sub-assemblies has become typical of the packaging of the process of production and distribution. The result is expressed in ways which not merely prohibit, but virtually outlaw the intelligent user's sense that he or she has a right to know what is actually inside the package he is about to ingest. At least the putative manufacturer ought to know, but often, apparently, he too does not. Try to buy a replacement part from the party under whose brand name the product was sold. How could that, is it putative or punitive? Putative.
Putative.
Yeah, manufacturer know
Alleged.
where to get the part or how to install it. He bought and installed the assembly within which that component, whatever it is buried somewhere, and the design of the component is in some place perhaps unknown. Such manifest trends signifying that during the recent 35 years, we have passed over from a production-oriented society to a consumption-driven society. Ours often appear to be a society with less concern for the nature of the stuff it is consuming than a desperately hungry rat for foraging in the garbage dump. The United States has been transformed from the nation of backyard, yeah, this is exactly what we're talking about, repairmen whose stubborn determination to make the things work contributed much to our capabilities for winning World War II. Ours has become a population employed increasingly in relatively unskilled services of persons who are conditioned not to wish to know what they are actually consuming, using, or doing. Benchmarking carries this process of degeneration to the logical extreme implicit in the information theory hoax. Benchmarking nominal designers of the product is no longer assured the means to challenge the assumptions underlying the mathematical packages he or she is combining into the design of a product. These are often products which will no longer be tested by former standards of automobile or other manufacturers' accountability, or for even the simple safety of the prescribed use of that product. It is cheaper, ostensibly more profitable, to kill people than to lessen the current diversion from income to shareholder value by spending what we used to spend to ensure the safety and other satisfaction of the user. Benchmarking virtually ensures that things move in such directions. It has been a process of slightly more than a decade in eliminating the existence of a type recognizable as a qualified design engineer. In summary of that and kindred observations, it is to be said that as part of the past 36 years shift away from a producer economy to a consumer society, policymakers and public have lost the capacity for insight into the requirements of producing the essentials of civilized life. Society has come to view the world economy itself as like nothing as much as an endless nightmare, searching for bargains amid a globalized huddle of gigantic Orwellian shopping malls. People just don't think the way they used to. 40 years or so ago, in the inhuman, poverty-stricken economic policies which they have come to prefer show it. These and related...
Wait, hold on there, Satomi. I noticed Susie's hand is up.
Could you put in simple terms what he's meaning by benchmarking?
Oh, sure. Does somebody else want to chime in, or do you want me to? Last reading.
Standardizing, I suppose, is a good analogy.
Standardizing? Yeah, standardizing. Yeah, basically in the problem of benchmarking as a mode of conducting designs of various things, cars being a big one, over recent years with the advent of real computer technology, is that when a new design is so-called discovered or come up or created, what will often happen is that innovation will be formalized, and then like Paul just said, it'll be standardized and used as the basis of building further future economic models, or not economic, sorry, future designs and models of cars upon those standards, without the engineers having necessarily gone through the process of thinking about the reality that gave rise to the standards. So everyone's just sort of using the formulas that are given to them more and more without knowing why they're true, and just adding to it, resulting in design defects that see, various, there's been cases where tires and SUVs have been built which have tipped over when they've like driven and taken an angle slightly too fast, that they're
Okay,
the mathematical models.
Can I try to put it into my words?
Yep.
Like setting standards that we now consider these to be our rules going forward, but those standards were not sound, but we're no longer going back and looking at that.
It's a much simpler way of saying it than what I was saying. Yes.
Yeah.
I'm dumber than you.
No, that's it takes brilliance to simplify a complex idea. No, that's great.
Oh,
Well,
wow, I'm brilliant now. Thank you.
Remember that one car that kept blowing up or something, and they figured that it was cheaper that so many people would be killed compared to what they'd have to, pay out in insurance or whatever compensation to having to fix that little part. I remember that case, the legal case. You remember that?
Yeah, it was like an early 1960s automobile or something.
Yeah, I mean,
Edna or something. Yeah.
That's how they think.
Yeah.
Hasn't
So
there
that's
been
how
recent stuff
they
on that?
Well, I think the
conclude.
Tesla car is catching fire all over the place is
Oh, yeah.
one example, I would say, probably.
But I remember hearing like Lexus or Volkswagen was also involved in something like that. It was like something that a recall thing that they just like ignored because they wanted to, because they thought they could pay out stuff or whatever. I remember hearing that somewhere. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean,
Well,
but that is,
yeah,
just
there's so many examples. I've read, I forget if it was a Sentra model recently that had to do a recall because a bunch of their airbags, their passenger airbags, just would go off when like speed bumps were hit. That wasn't supposed to happen, and just would like shatter people's necks. So like there's so many cases that these should not be problems, but people are just too reliant on computer models instead of thinking about reality.
Again, the current example, the entirety of the pharma industry.
Phone?
Well, known for deciding that they're making more money out of a certain drug, that despite the fact that there are side effects and they get sued for it or they have to pay out compensation, they make more money in the drug in the end, so it's just written off as a business expense.
Oh, yes, right.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the same modality.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's more in your face has been for the last 2.5, 3 years.
Yes.
Yeah. These and related trends considered as a whole are reduced to a single underlying issue. The fostering of the cult of information theory has defined a quality of society in which people's knowledge of what they are doing or of what is being done to them might remind us of those students in Jonathan Swift's tale of Lumiere Gulliver's visit to the island of Laputa, where students learned by swallowing slips of paper on which was written the information they were to assimilate in that fashion. The slips of paper might have been written by 18th century versions of tech writers who took courses in the equivalent of today's program learning instead of science and engineering. Perhaps, therefore, it was Jonathan Swift, not Norbert Wiener, who invented information theory. that as a joke on ivory tower varieties of 18th century academic asses in general. The breed of such asses has not been improved since.
Ho, ho.
The pervading issue among all of those issues listed, and also many other leading contemporary cultural disorders, is the failure of common practice to recognize the essential features of the principled distinction of the behavior of man from that of beasts. In each of the listed and many additional examples of the same principled social dysfunction, the pathological element is the same. The essential element is the failure to apply the processes of cognition to the formation and communication of those ideas which are of crucial importance for sustaining the viability of an existing culture. In this celebrated essay, A Defense of Poetry, Shelley describes the Renaissance, a period in which there is, as I have stated above, a general increase of the power of imparting and receiving profound and impassioned conceptions respecting man and nature. The expression of post-1945 intellectual decadence, especially post-1962 to 65 decadence, which I have just sampled here, typify periods in which these morals and intellectual powers tend to vanish into a condition like that of the 17th century Britain, depicted by Hogarth or by Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travel, or described by Cotton Mather as his observation on the period of decadence of the post-1688 Massachusetts Bay Colony. In contrast to these periods of
Do you want to
decadence,
read the footnotes? Oh, in this case,
Oh,
it's just a reference to Graham and Lowry's
Just a
Hibernation
reference
was one.
to the, yeah.
all right.
in contrast to such periods of decadence, the leaders whose influence distinguished the quality of renaissances, such as reference case of the leaders of the 15th century Renaissance, walked the users of a technology through the cognitive experience of the passage from the initial ontological paradox, which prompted the search for the hypothesis which would solve that paradox, through to the experimental work which proved the hypotheses. In all known cases of a Renaissance, Shelley's formulation is clearly upheld. Examples of this include the cultural Renaissance known as the German classic, which was led by such avowed followers of Gottfried Leibniz and Jonathan Sebastian Bach as Kastner, Lessing, Moses, Mendelssohn, Goethe, Schiller, Wolfgang Mozart, Ludwig van Beethoven, and Humboldt brothers for the German-speaking world. The examples include the Italy-centered 15th century Renaissance earlier. This effervescence shown in such renaissances and the power of communication of profound and impassioned conceptions of man and nature always express certain specific qualities which have a common form and character of expression, whether in physical science or in classical modes of artistic composition. It is the dominant role of those modes within certain influential currents within a culture which warrants describing such expressions of moral and intellectual fertility as specifically classical, as distinct from and opposed to the quality of the French and English 18th century Enlightenment, for example, or Romantic, Modernist, or Postmodernist effusions. The principle of any such classical productive experience is the same in principle as that of the student in a class who are each simultaneously experiencing the way in which some original discovery of universal physical principle was prompted and accomplished. The successful student had relived the act of discovery and empirical verification. Intellectually, he now owned the principle whose act of discovery he had replicated within his own cognitive processes. The reenactment of the cognitive act of discovery, rather than programmed learning, for example, must become recognized once again as the standard for transmission of knowledge within a society. Probably that sort of sanity about economics will become prevalent only when the standards exemplified by Wilhelm von Humboldt's program for classical humanist education are restored as a model for what secondary education throughout humanity must become. As a matter of first approximation, we may divide communications expressing the quality of explicitly cognitive activity into the sovereign personal act of discovery by an individual, in the process by means of which cooperation in the use of those discoveries of principle is motivated in relation among persons within society. Classical modes of artistic composition typify the modes of cognitive cooperation. Plastic and non-plastic modes of classical artistic composition, especially the non-plastic modes in poetry, drama, and polyphonic music, typify the form of the latter cognitive modes. But the significance of such art is that it also serves society as a model for understanding history and for formulating policies of government. Examples of this include the opening paragraphs of the 1776 U.S. Declaration of Independence, the preamble of the U.S. Federal Constitution, and President Abraham Lincoln's 1863 Gettysburg Address. Each and all these examples are consistent with the intent of a Renaissance. Back during the 1948-1952 interval, as a result of seeing issues implicit in the difference between what we may recognize as a classical, humanist, and contrary, morally defective forms of education, I came to recognize a lesson of crucial significance to be adduced from comparing mathematical formulas used to describe aspects of physical processes and the often contrasting mental image expressed by a rigorously composed verbal description of what might be presumed to be the same process. On the surface, a good verbal description of the process and the mathematical representation could be at least ostensibly consistent. Yet a good verbal representation conveyed important included notions which were lost in the translation, as if stripped away by Occam's razor when stated in the generally accepted classroom form of mathematics. Over the course of the 1947-48 interval, I approached this paradox from the standpoint of classical forms of poetry, drama, and classical settings of poetry as song. I pose the question, why is good classical poetry superior as a disposition of mind over mathematical language in conveying important ideas of physical science? Years later, I discovered that like the greatest teacher of both Lessing and Goss-Kasner, the best classical poets already knew the answers. In thinking through the apparent paradox, one should come to the eerie and therefore truthful conclusion that the act of cognition exists only within the limits of the sovereign cognitive process of an individual mind, but that the possibility of the validation and realization of that discovery for social practice lies in an aspect of social relations, which can be regulated only, paradoxically, by human individuals. When the significance of those cognitive forms of social relations are viewed in a certain special way, the individual develops a quality of personal moral character, which sets him or her apart from the run-of-the-mill among nominal leaders, as exceptionally qualified to be a leader in that society. Friedrich Schiller's follower, the Wilhelm von Humboldt, who launched 19th century Germany's system of classical humanist education, has emphasized the same connection which I came to recognize from my own vantage point during the course of the 1947-1952 interval between classical humanist education and the development of the moral character of the student. Up to the present time, in known history, the primary distinction of the individual
Wait a
of
minute,
truly moral.
Satomi. There's
Yeah.
a footnote 41, which looks pretty substantial. Somebody want to read that?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'll read that one for you.
Sure.
On the subject of the form of socialized relations which develop between man and beast within the framework of social processes, my wife and I have come to share the relevant view of the scientist theologian Nicholas Cusa. I mean the notion that the inferior species, the socialized animal of household and herd, participates in the higher species, man. This is demonstrated perhaps most easily or most commonly in the laughter-filled play between child and puppy. The puppy participates happily in the games invented by the child and can learn those games, as animals in the wild also do, but cannot invent those games as the child does. This view of the matter encourages an impulse for humane dealings with both cultivated and wild animals.
No, that's good. Yeah. Up to the present time in known history, the primary distinction of the individual of truly moral character from the more ordinary members of the society is a certain kind of impassioned attachment to his or her personal cognitive relations to the greatest known creative thinkers of the past and the future. By reliving the experience of replicating the act of original discovery of truly universal principles from the past, that individual brings that moment from that original discoverer into his or her own sovereign cognitive processes. He or she brings that cognitive moment from the mind of the original discovery to life within his or her own cognitive processes. If the education and related development of the young person is steered with great emphasis on this kind of cognitive act, this quality of historically determined cognitive experience affords the young person an insight into the proper definition of truthfulness. But the groundswell in the educational and related development of the young, that young person will soon begin to think of his or her own future adult life as having the character of a personal mission. The child will express that sense of mission in such forms as driving the importance of the profession or equivalent he or she intends to accomplish when I am grown up. This is often expressed with a manifest aura of spontaneity and passion. One senses that that child owns that sense of mission. For the Christian, for example, the sense of Jesus Christ's gripping sense of mission expressed in such ways as J.S. Bach's setting of the Passion of St. John and St. Matthew typifies the sense of the immortality of the individual cognitive self residing within the mortality of the individual. Such a person lives for all humanity, for all time, with special emphasis on the mission implicit in the society, the culture with which he or she is immediately most closely associated. The distinction of the leader is that he or she puts that universal mission and interest foremost and resists the diverting, immoral temptation flowing from a contrary passion for my own and my community's immediate interest in the here and now. The person who is capable of meeting the requirement implicit in such a challenge excuses himself in such forms as the following expression: yes, I care about the future of my country and the world too, but my immediate family and community interests in the here and now must come first. The less moral person can sometimes lend lip service to the words, of course I know that since I am mortal, I should care about the kind of world I leave behind me, but I must work within the culture of my society. There we have, once again, as in Shakespeare's case of Hamlet, the moral failure. Hamlet is not the cause of the doom of his Denmark. He, like Fortinbras, is an expression of the fatal moral flaw which pervades the leadership and more of his culture at that time. His fatal error is to be an obedient participant in the popular culture of the realm. Only a leader who could save the realm from itself would have been of any use in that circumstance. Between being and not, he chose explicitly in the course of the soliloquy not to be. Only the leader who marches out of step can bring that parade safely across the bridge of crises to the safety of the future. The true leader, as I have just summarily described those distinctions, is a leader because he or she places the emphasis on cognitive relations rather than merely sense-perceptual ones. Herein lies Leibniz's passion for the truthfulness which Kant or Kant's followers abhorred. There is a corrupted false lurking within the heart of every Kant. The Kantian, is it Kantian or Kantian? Or
I would say
his life abhors the truth because the truth might deprive him of his preference for those circus-like learned tricks by means of which he hopes he might reap the sensual pleasures of earthly paradise. It is when the individual view of society is that of a sovereign cognitive agency, maintaining the continuity of the development from the past into the future, that the individual has a sense of himself or herself, which is truly a moral one. That is to say, it is only in that view of the immortal self, the cognitive self lodged in the mortal passage from the past to the future, that that person is motivated to recognize his and his society's essential self-interest. He finds that essential self-interest in the outcome of the present for both that society in particular and humanity in general. He locates himself or herself in personal devotion to the intention that society's self-interest will be honorably served. This is precisely the moral quality which the putative leadership of today's United States has lost, a quality which is generally withered away, decade by decade, since the ultimate death of Franklin Roosevelt. Now, that summary given, taken into account what has been explicitly written or referenced in this report up to this point, the challenge of statecraft is to effect and maintain progress in the quality of the human condition across successive generations. That must be the orbit of our intention, in the sense that Kepler introduces intention as the notion of an efficient, universal physical principle. Against the backdrop of such considerations, the relative quality of the type and mode of communication employed to organize scientific and other foreign cooperation becomes a subject of crucial importance in itself, as I am stressing and elaborating some essential features of that argument here. The challenge of statecraft, especially in times of crises, is the production and role of those qualified to be leaders, so qualified by their dedication to fostering the influence of the higher morality within the mass of a general population, which otherwise cannot free itself from the fatal trap of small-minded and hence corrupting, intrinsically immoral obsession with the smallness of soul, expressed by obsession with personal, family, and community relations. This brings us to a crucial aspect of the matter which Shelley addresses in his A Defense of Poetry, the specific role of ambiguity in the cognitive aspects of communication. Gosh.
Homie, that was excellent reading. Very good.
But that, I think we have to kind of, because I don't see, why can't it be N and or? Like, I think we have to sometimes think about family and our immediate needs.
I think what he's saying, Satomi, is that there has been corruption doesn't come in by just saying, hey, I'm corrupt, let me come into your house. It always comes in masquerading as something that has the appearance of the good. And no one can deny that caring about your family and your community and friends is good. That's a very good thing. But when it's done at the expense of concern for an awareness of what the whole is that your community or family is a part of, then you have the corruption seeping in a bad way. And I think that's part of the problem in the past several generations, and it's gotten worse and worse, of people losing a concern and a moral sense of responsibility for what the world is doing, and understanding what the world actually is, instead of just being given a chimera by the media, but really understanding it. People have become detached. And if you think about, like, World War II, think of all those people who volunteered to give their lives, to go off and risk their life and die across an ocean for what? Or the people who fought and died in the American Revolution or Civil War. They couldn't have had they had to have a much stronger, higher sense of morality about the danger of what fascism means as a global phenomenon, or what the destruction of the Union would mean. That was worth risking their lives, and even the ability for their spouses, their widows, to even pay the bills easily if they're gone, or manage to raise kids. That was worth the sacrifice, the risk, in order to preserve humanity. And today's world has slipped away, I think, is what he's saying, from that sense of deeper morality which we once had.
Yes, yes, but yeah, well, because we grew up in such a prosperous, fairly peaceful time.
Well, that's the problem. When
I
people
think that,
don't ask where their prosperity was coming from. That was part of the
yes,
corruption too. They stopped caring that actually slave labor was being used around the world to feed our dollaramas and we stopped producing for ourselves, but we stopped asking, well, who's doing the production, who's doing the work for pennies a day if it's not us? And it really was a virulent
yes,
form of evil that we permitted
yes,
to support our affluence for a few decades. But now it's like,
yes,
time's coming to
yes,
face the fact that we shouldn't have let that happen.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah, I see what you say. I mean, but it's just proportional. We have to still care for family and
Oh yeah,
community,
yeah.
but
he's not saying don't give a shit about
get
your
the big,
family, of
yeah,
course.
get the bigger picture, yeah, which
Yeah,
is
yeah,
really, yes, more well, critical.
yeah, yeah. With Susie, what's your thought?
But even trying to do the work to heal and rebuild after the trauma of the war, it put families and communities into that smaller, we have to take care of ourselves and do what's best for us. So we didn't realize just how much the rot was creeping through the system, because they themselves still had more of the cognitive framework and the moral framework in that generation. And they didn't realize just how much it was being watered down for their own children. Just even trying to read through your articles that you've been sending out, they embedded selfishness and, like you said, hedonism in the very foundation of the system, but most people didn't realize it. But I really do believe it's changing today. And so much of, like, the homeschool community is going back to a more classical education. And, we've all learned by experience, it really is more blessed to give than to receive. And so we're breaking out of that selfish mold. So we really can't help but drag the rest of society with us, I hope, into just really breaking out of those mindsets that were imposed on us. I hope that's what I'm seeing.
Mm-hmm. Well, look at when I was reading that, I was thinking the classical teaching. Kwan has really given us such a great, idea of, in China, that whole classical teaching. I mean, and the difference between that and, like, program learning. Wow.
And to also bring back that each of these ancient cultures, they
Mhm.
all have their strengths, and each of these philosophies have their beauty. And to
Mhm.
find the places that they come together and are saying the same things, just maybe in different terms,
Yes.
instead of everybody staying so compartmentalized and segregated and fragmented.
Yeah, and I love that whole the individual making what they're learning their own, owning what
Yes.
they're learning.
I think that was one of the things that really struck me the most is the idea that a society has vitality and viability to the degree that the units of that society, which is each sovereign individual, is encouraged to have understanding of what they are and what the processes are that they're consuming and creating. And so they're not just treating cups as though they just magically appeared in the store, your corn or fruits as if they appeared in the grocery store, but they look at the corn, they look at the tomatoes, they look at the computer, they look at the cup, and they see a process with their mind's eye, and they can appreciate the web of interconnectedness. And to the degree that understanding is motivating all of the parts as active thinking, your society has that living force, that vibe, that vitality. And when that disappears and is dissipated and replaced by machine thinking, or letting machine type of processes replace the things that we used to do with our own thought, then you lose that vitality. You lose that ability to reproduce your society, and people don't know. They become more atomized, more severed, more ignorant, and more mystified, right? More magically minded. They start thinking of the universe in a more um, irrationalistic way, and no longer, and they're thus more manipulatable by forces that are dishonest, as we've come to realize in our current world today. Which is where I'm very struck by looking at China's configuration, for example, of their leadership in their political class. And I was reading an article not that long ago, and I cite this a lot, that a disproportionately huge amount of their statesmen on provincial and federal levels are trained engineers and people with real world experience who practiced real knowledge in the real world before actually managing the departments and systems that are so-called political. Whereas in the West, we just have people who have, they're trained to be sophists and rhetoricians in law school, and
Lawyers.
they go off and are told to, like, now you're a minister of health or a minister of defense, and this person's never been in the military, Jens Stoltenberg, and you're supposed to be like deciding war and peace. Like, what the hell? It's wild.
Yeah, yes. That's why I love crafts. I love artisans too. I remember one potter, she had on her business card, when you buy a piece of my pottery, you buy a piece of my life. Purchase a piece of my life, because um, she puts her heart and soul into it.
It makes it more real. That's good. Yeah.
I think that last little paragraph kind of sums up the whole of today's discussion. The challenge of statecraft, especially in terms of crisis, is the production and role of those qualified to be leaders, so qualified by their dedication to fostering the influence of the higher morality within the mass of the general population. I'll just simply stop there. That number one, that is the challenge of statecraft, and it can be done. How it's to be done is the big question. But I would suggest that even the little community groups, if I call it, what we are here at the moment, having our discussions, etc., is contributing to that. I think it makes I could make a fair argument that as I say, this
Absolutely.
community groups like this, which are springing up everywhere, folks. We're far from the only ones involved in discussions like this.
Well, certainly.
That sooner or later there will be, leaders of a sort, whether it be group leadership or whatever, but it will emerge.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully.
Hmm.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, I was thinking, there's a lot obviously that we went through, and it's worth rereading. I have a little extract from Shelley's Defense of Poetry, which we could look over quickly. There's also, I would like people to take note of a few things that he mentioned as far as healthy, good high cultural entertainment when you're looking for something to do in the course of the following 6 or 7 days. Specifically, listening to Bach's St. John's Passion or the St. Matthew's Passion, in the context of how he was developing the sense of Christ's mission that Bach had felt so deeply in his heart, and which definitely comes through in his music, which if you're not looking for it, you may not feel it. It may bounce off of you. As many people, I listened to St. John's Passion at the Montreal's Place des Arts, and you could sense that the people both performing it, it was very stiff. They didn't feel a sense of spiritual passion, the performers, I mean, and the people listening were, you could see that just listening to the conversations, people were more or less just sort of there because they were bored, because it was like a cultural thing to do, a reason to dress up. But there was not that authenticity, which I think would make Bach somewhat annoyed, to say the least. But try to find a good performance, and maybe I'll find one and send an email out, and just try to listen to it with this spirit in mind and think about what he's saying. And the other thing is Swift's Gulliver's Travels, like what Swift does, what William Hogarth does with Hogarth's etchings, his cartoons around the same time in the 16th century, are amazing little cultural interventions into the society's problem. Like the best way to diagnose a society, or the best diagnostics you could see, are from the artists, especially the satirists, who feel this strong passion, and they can just feel the melancholy irony of a beautiful society made in the image of God acting like you know like rats, and you're made for something better, and they're using humor to try to get people to become a little bit shaken up by their immorality. So those are a couple things to hold in mind, and I'll just send out an email actually with some links to these things. And the last thing I would say on the issue of leadership, do you guys remember what he was saying about the importance of leadership in education and society?
You mean in
Quality
terms of Hamlet?
education. Quality education.
The importance of a leader walking out of only the leader who marches out of step. Yeah, that's, I think, a really important idea, to not be a Hamlet, but to rather, because the best way to get elected is to say what the people want to hear, right? Isn't that the best way to be popular and to get elected and to keep a job in politics, is to be popular and say what they want to hear? But he's saying it's the opposite. If you want to be a leader, is you got to say what they don't want to hear. You have to challenge the society's delusions. Don't mirror them. And in that sense, Martin Luther King is a great example of somebody who is. There was a speech that this reminded me of his. You guys ever hear of his importance of being maladjusted when you're in a sick, insane society? He's like, yeah, everybody's talking about the new fad is being socially well adjusted. And he's saying, like, yeah, that's all well and good if your society is healthy and moral, but if your society is sick like ours is, that's a sign of shame. You should be proud to be socially maladjusted. That's a good thing. And
Yeah, I remember saying to somebody that the last thing I wanted for my children was for them to be normal.
good, very good.
Yeah, that's a good point. That because I was just going to say, sometimes it's the leadership that is so reflective of the things that are happening in our society too, because we don't have good leaders.
Mm-hmm.
But several paragraphs before what you were talking about just there, Matt, several paragraphs before, he was describing the type of moral young person that is built from the classical education and, these cognitive processes. And, I was immediately thinking, well, that's exactly why we don't have that type of education anymore, because it will produce leaders.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't want leaders. They didn't want statesmen anymore. They wanted to be able to put the trained propagandists in place.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well,
Got our work cut out for us.
Abigail
Still.
Adams had a great quote. And by the way, Declan, props to your parents again. Declan just did. He performed with his sister in Macbeth, and he was a stage. You're also operating as.
Yeah. Well, I was kind of like the assistant to the teacher, and so I was helping a lot of running through stuff like that, as well as being in the play itself. So it was a lot
That's
of fun.
great. Do you have a recording of that,
Yeah,
by the way?
yeah, we actually do.
Can you
I'll have to
digitize it and
ask.
make it available?
I don't know. I'll really have to ask the kids involved. I don't know if they would want it out there.
Yeah. All right.
What
Yeah.
play? Is it a play?
Yeah, it was Macbeth.
Oh, Macbeth. Oh, wow.
Yeah, very. It was for Halloween because, well, you need to do a creepy play then, and Macbeth is pretty much the most creepy play of them all.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. That's good. And it wasn't redacted. It was like the full play.
Yeah, it's pretty much the full play. I think there was some lines cut to shorten things to help people memorize, but there wasn't like anything really big cut out at all.
Great. Wow. Powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't have anything like that as far as like my school experience. Um,
Mm.
Abigail Adams was John Quincy Adams' mom, and she said something fantastic to the effect that I paraphrase that she's oh, happy that there are crises that they're navigating through. When this was when John Quincy was still a kid, but she said, and it's in times of normalcy, you don't see the creation of great men, which she really saw. She had high hopes that her son was going to rise to the occasion of not being a Hamlet sort of character. And they were reading Shakespeare, like her and John Adams. They were reading Shakespeare. They would talk. She would write about it, and I think the mother was a huge influence in the family development. And they would translate Plato from original Greek into English. And John Adams is like writing to her, talking about the development of or the advancement on the translation of the Theaetetus dialogue. And they would read Shakespeare in the household too. It was all like just part of what they were doing. And the kid went on to become like ambassador to Russia by the time he was 16 or 17 or something. Like it was just wild rates of development.
Oh wow.
Mm.
Well, it's just like my friend. She would always, every time we'd have our movie night, she'd show, I noticed there's a pattern with her. She'd show people in ordinary people in extraordinary situations that have to come up to, to take that crises and handle it, and how they grow from that. But it just, that is a development, a way of development. I mean, it's you have to really, it just takes everything out of you. But I love those movies that she would show.
Yeah, the issue of classical humanist education is probably the most political thing and the most dangerous thing to the oligarchy is the establishment of real, because it's one thing when you have an outlier here or there arise, but if it can be made like Wilhelm von Humboldt did in Germany, if it can be made into an institution and these practices are permitted to really take deeper root to the point that they even allow for the transmission of these methods of thinking from more than one generation, then you have something that can really, really grow fast, like incredibly fast. And a Renaissance movement can happen quicker than many people realize in that sense. And the oligarchy is very afraid of that. I think that's one of the deepest points of insecurity.
Can you repeat that again? Deepest sense of security is the
Insecurity.
rise of
Insecurity. Sorry. If I said
insecurity.
security, I meant to say insecurity.
Is the rise of
The types of education systems that encourage students to have understanding instead of just memorizing things.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. The classical teachings. Yeah. Yeah.
I think this is probably a good spot here. Let me let's stop the share. I'm gonna share a screen on my end of I just sent in the chat box Shelley's In Defense of Poetry. And let's do maybe a read through the last little section of that just to make it more visceral, since he referenced it like 8 times in this little piece. I think some people here have probably read this, right? Has anybody never read Shelley's In Defense of Poetry essay?
Years ago.
Okay. So he's often referencing the last concluding section. And I think a good spot might be here. And, keep in mind, Shelley is himself, he's a poet who he dies young, probably murdered. He was very close friends with Keats. They were both engaged, and you can get this in their, especially in their essays, but you see it in many of their poems. They were engaged in cultural warfare. They were self-aware of what they were trying to awaken in the population, both of England, but also the broader English-speaking world. But also they were aware of what they were up against. They were both sensitive to forces that were intentionally working to undermine the cognitive powers of the people of Britain and the world. So they were very, very powerful people, and what they were able to do in the short course of their lives is really something. Declan, do you want to read it from the standpoint of maybe just poetry, and we'll just like read this one little bit.
Okay, this one paragraph?
Let's just read to the end of that. It's short.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sure. All right. Starting at poetry, as has been said, differs in this respect from logic, that it is not subject to control of the active powers of the mind, and that its birth and reoccurrence have no necessary connection with the consciousness or will. It is presumptuous to determine that these are the necessary conditions of all mental causation, when mental effects are experienced and insusceptible of being referred to them. The frequent reoccurrence of the poetical power, it is obvious to suppose, may produce in the mind a habit of order and harmony correlative with its own nature and with its effect upon other minds. But in the intervals of inspiration, and they may be frequent without being durable, a poet becomes a man, and is abandoned to the sudden reflux of the influences under which others habitually live. But as he is more delicately organized than other men, and sensible to pain and pleasure, both his own and that of others, in a degree unknown to them, he will avoid the one and pursue the other with an ardor proportioned to this difference. And he renders himself obnoxious to calumny when he neglects to
slander.
When he neglects to observe the circumstances under which these objects of universal pursuit and flight have disguised themselves in one another's garments. But there is nothing necessarily evil in this error, and thus cruelty, envy, revenge, avarice, and the passions purely evil have never formed any portion of the popular imputations on the lives of poets. I have thought it most favorable to the cause of truth to set down these remarks according to the order in which they were suggested to my mind, by a consideration of the subject itself, instead of observing the formality of a polemical reply. But if the view which they contain be just, they will be found to involve a refutation of the arguers against poetry, so far at least as regards the first diversion of the subject. I can readily conjecture what should have moved the gall of some learned and intelligent writers who quarrel with certain
Versifiers. Yeah.
versifiers. I confess myself, like them, unwilling to be stunned by the thucydides of the Horace Codbury of the day. Bavius and Mavius undoubtedly are, as they ever were, insufferable persons, but it belongs to a philosophical critic to distinguish rather than confound. The first part of these remarks has been related to poetry in its elements and principles. and it has been shown, as well as the narrow limits assigned them would permit, that what is called poetry is in a restricted sense has a common source with all other forms of order and beauty, according to which the materials of human life are susceptible of being arranged, and which is poetry in a universal sense.
So this last segment here that we're about to read is like the key thing that LaRouche is often referring to, and on your own time, it'll be good to read the whole essay. And just hold in mind, what I didn't say is that he's written this in refutation to someone who has made the argument that poetry, serious people should abandon poetry, which is an irrelevant practice in the utilitarian age of mechanics and the industrial age, where people should get serious and just learn things that have utilitarian value. And he's basically saying, no, poetry is actually the most important, and this is when you need it more than ever because it's the thing that gives you access to your moral faculties in the most clear way.
Yeah.
And it's something which allows us to discover who we are. And without that, we become robots and we become essentially soulless. So poetry is a much broader idea than what most people would allow it. And then this last part here is where he really gets into the meat of it.
Okay. The second part will have for its object an application of these principles to the present state of the cultivation of poetry, and a defense of the attempt to idealize the modern forms of manners and opinions, and compel them into a subordination to the imaginative and creative faculty. For the literature of England, an energetic development of which has ever preceded or accompanied a great and free development of the national will, has arisen as it were from a new birth. In spite of the low-thoughted envy which would undervalue contemporary merit, our own will be a memorable age in intellectual achievements, and we live among such philosophers and poets as surpass beyond comparison any who have appeared since the last national struggle for civil and religious liberty. The most unfailing herald, companion, and follower of the awakening of a great people to work a beneficial change in opinion or institution is poetry. As such periods, there is an accumulation of the power of communicating and the receiving intense and impassioned conceptions respecting man and nature. The person in whom this power resides may often, as far as regards many portions of their nature, have little apparent correspondence with the spirit of good of which they are the ministers. But even whilst they deny and abjure, they are yet compelled to serve that power which is seated on the throne of their own soul. It is impossible to read the compositions of the most celebrated writers of the present day without being startled with the electric life which burns within their words. They measure the circumference and sound the depths of human nature with a comprehensive and all-penetrating spirit, and they are themselves perhaps the most sincerely astonished at its manifestations. For it is less their spirit than the spirit of the age. Poets are the hierophants of the unapprehended inspiration, the mirrors of the gigantic shadows which futurity casts upon the present, the words which express what they understand not, the trumpets which sing about it and feel not what they inspire, the influence which is moved not but moves. Poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world.
That was it's different from our day because our day is different from, I mean, it's a very different age from the world of 1819 that Shelley was writing in, because that was a world where there was a bit more vibrancy in the sense of, there were people who lived through the American Revolution. There was still hope that the Republican spirit of emancipation from hereditary powers of monarchies could also still happen in Europe. So he's talking about a sort of a different process, but there's something really beautiful about that. Whereas, I mean, in our age, in our part of the world, at least, we don't have that type of cultural vitality. But the idea that even people who don't necessarily themselves, their nature would not be so inclined to fight for revolutionary inspired ideas poetically, they're yet, despite that, the in his world, writing things and doing things that betray their own character because they're swept up by something that they don't even fully understand. But it's truthful, it's good, you know, and that's it's a powerful idea because I think when you can get like a process going, you could find that people who would otherwise be in the middle ground in the gray zone would find themselves being instruments for the good. It's much easier to adapt to a good process than to adapt to evil, which is another thing that the oligarchy does think about too, is how to keep that breaking point, that threshold from being reached. Because they know that if you just get a small, tiny proportion of the population to act in a self-aware, good way, they could create a field which would pull in many, many more people to do also the good without understanding it fully.
One could argue
Yeah.
that that's happening.
I would hope
Yeah.
so.
Yeah, to some degree
Well,
at least. Yeah, sure.
It's kind of like
well, I,
all.
Yep.
I was just gonna say all evil tends towards chaos, and so any sort of order is good, and that and that the and that when you have order, people are gonna go gravitate towards it because it's good, and in that sense, and so that's why when you see like in a horror movie, if you have a cold killer who's very deliberate and orderly in the way he does it, it's so much more creepy because he's doing something that's good in a way, but he's doing
Oh,
something
I
that's
see what you're
evil.
saying. Right. He's using order to achieve, yes, systematic approach to getting a very horrific, terrible effect. It's an interesting way of thinking about it. Yeah, I was thinking about a puzzle. I was thinking about a more innocent idea. How you'll never, as much as one might try, you'll never be able to make money over the idea of like selling people puzzles that are already built and then just having them like scramble them. People, no matter what, kind of want to put puzzles together, right? You
Yeah,
want to put order to a symmetry of harmony to parts that seem to be broken up, and it gives you pleasure. But that was my yeah. But you're right. No, definitely, we're our hearts are tuned to order. Yeah.
uh, it might it might sound a little bit strange, but I would say that uh, poetry or music, quality music, would provoke that kind of superior emotions that would bring us to that field of creativity precisely because um, uh, poetry is probably with music one of the most powerful tools to open that space from the rut of the intellect. Uh, because once again, I always goes back to the six steps proposed by Plato. Intellect is a part of the ordinary mind that uh, that that is working every day. Okay, and it's part of the intellect and to memorize, to have a certain order by classification, and that classification can be a routine, which is quite useful too. And the depth of the mind is that you stay in the intellect rather than to have those opening uh, that are possible because of the inherent nature of poetry, using metaphors or using paradoxes, the paradox beyond the opinion. That's the meaning of paradox, meaning that it will bring in images or concepts that are apparently in contradiction. But because of those apparent contradictions, you are forced to uplift yourself above the routine of the intellect. And I think that it's one of the uh, powerful insight by Plato that at a certain level of mind development correspond a type of man, okay? Because uh, uh, once again, the senses, perceptions, and intellect are modes of understanding and apprehension of reality. And those modes are not uh, infertile by themselves, okay? They give certain capacity, certain practical results, but they tend to stay there and not going beyond. And precisely everything that would bring a certain contradictions, apparent contradictions at the level of intellect, would bring us to that malaise. But if that malaise is combined at the same time with a certain excitement of a certain superior emotions, let's say, it would push us to find the solution to that malaise. And maybe two words that could be very useful are precisely metaphor and paradoxes, because many metaphors are paradoxes. And metaphors can be used to clarify a situation or to use to obfuscate a situation. But that obfuscation can be done on purpose to create more openings in the understanding of reality. And maybe the movement of the planets can be a good example, okay? Ptolemy tried to solve it at the senses perception by creating the epicycles, who are collage and open collage with a very complex mechanism to explain why certain movement would go back at a certain time of the year and would go in the other side at the other time of the year. And Kepler would go deeper and would solve the apparent paradoxes of those contradictory movements by going deeper or higher, because deeper or higher are synonym, of course. So there's a lot of things to talk about metaphor, I suppose, and paradoxes. But and I suppose that technically, those are the two big doors or gates to creativity: paradoxes and metaphors.
I chuck analogy in there as well.
Yes. Or maybe a contiguity, okay? Because in a metaphor, but I understand.
We're often using an analogy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wait. Because hold on. Can somebody please just give me a definition, the difference clearly between an analogy and a metaphor? Go.
Oh, yes, because the analogy is, well, I wouldn't try first, because it's a big concept, okay? I don't pretend to give the definite answer. But the metaphor is the representation of something by something else, and you stop there, okay? Because that's the basic definition of a metaphor. It's from, once again, I like very much etymology, okay? Metaphoros in Greek means transfer of property, okay? It might sound very strange that a very poetical word that means transfer of property at the very low level, or simply transfer, okay? So it means that you transfer something on another thing. But here, what Paul said by analogy, well, analogy is a mechanism of metaphor, but that's not the only way of metaphor, okay? It's not the only a tool to produce a metaphor, because you can make the rapprochement between two stuff, because there are something that is common between the two stuff, okay? So that's analogy, okay? If the king, for example, often the king would be represented by a lion. So what is common between the king and the lion is the force, okay, the strength or the majesty, okay? You can, and inside the analogy, you can have many points of rapprochement.
Okay.
Okay. That's But analogy is only one metaphoristic mechanism. It's not the only one. You can use a metonymy, okay? metonymy. A metonymy is a form of metaphor. So once again, the basic definition of metaphor is there's a transfer between two stuff. Okay, that's all. Okay, but what kind of transfer? Yes, and the analogy is one kind of transfer, and the metonymy is another kind of transfer. For example, you would say there are 3,000 souls in the city. Okay, souls here represent the people. There are 3,000 people in the city. So you will take something pertaining to the people, representing them. So that's another kind of metaphor, but it's not the only two mechanism of metaphor. Metaphor being a very big concept, having many possible transference mechanism. And here precisely, because when you use metaphor, you will try to find what exact mechanism with no S and with S would make the rapprochement between two stuff, two situations, two persons, and that open the space for creativity. And intellect would go to the definition, because after all, I gave a certain number of definition, okay, from my memory. That is the intellectual function. But that intellectual function is only a servant. You use that intellectual function to give you stuff so you can create that opening space. And that is and in that nexus, that the metaphoric process is also the creative process.
In both cases, computers wouldn't do well at discernment of either analogy or metaphor, probably, unless we programmed the answer into the computer's logarithm already.
I don't know if it has been tried recently, but I would like to. I don't, because I'm not a computer engineer, but would we be capable to put into a computer the Parmenides paradox and see how the computer would react to that? I think that it would be something very fun to do.
I'm not a programmer. I would wonder. Yeah, I mean, I think the computer would have to sort of come up with, or at least have some sort of a negative feedback loop that causes it to probably start smoking.
Well, I was going to say it would freeze, wouldn't it?
Well, Susan, once again, I am delighted always by your answer, because my fantasy and my desire would to see the computer implode or explode. You know, there's an image in one of the old movie of Star Trek when you see the robot, a very advanced robot, okay, but when he's presented with a series of paradox, and he just implode at the end. So,
but I just really want to go ahead and say, in my simpler terms, I'm really trying to branch out into reading more poetry, because it is really good at connecting the different portions of your brain that may not have been trained to work together properly. You know, the logical and the analytical over here and the creative over there. But then also, when you've got analytical problems that you're trying to solve, that you're struggling with, if you can move into something like poetry, it's almost like it gives your mind a rest and recreation and refreshing. And so then when you come back to the problem that you're working on, a lot of times those things can slip into place better now. So I think I said in my very childish manner what Quan has been talking about for the last 10 minutes.
Yeah, exactly. Well, the way you said that is that the poetry is, once again, I like very much etymology. Poetry is from Greek poen, okay, and poen means synthesis, and
Oh, perfect. Talk about
and
analogy.
an analogy is logien, and logien is more uh, the um, the logical the logical speech. Okay, so it's precisely that dialectical interaction between the linear speech and the poetic speech, opening the thing. Uh, exactly. Uh, and it's the same. And the lo the logical stuff cannot be creative, okay? Because the logical stuff precisely obey to logical rules. And it's not a surprise that Aristotle wrote the organon. Okay, organon is means the rules of logics, and it's not also not a surprise that Plato wrote his dialogues, which are much more poetical and much more creative. And I think that uh, it's not a coincidence that there is a certain opposition between the Aristotelian worldview and the Platonician worldview. And both reflects a certain reality. Okay, I don't think that Aristotle is to be put to the dustbin, but Plato has the upper hand. But both interact in their own domains.
Mm-hmm.
I think we all ought to find ways of encouraging all of the people around us to read poetry, to memorize poetry, because it will help to heal and enliven minds and hearts, and it will help to heal our societies.
Yeah.
I think you're right. I definitely think you're right, Susie.
And I love it when people start talking about metaphor, because I have found that God speaks to me in metaphors all the time. I mean, God does not have wings, but the verses that talk about him gathering us under his wings are so very real. And I have chickens, and you see a chicken cluck to her little babies, and then they all come and gather under her wings. And that's exactly what God wants each and every one of us to do.
Well, yeah, I mean the Bible when you're looking for it is and Shelley even talks about this very much in the Defense of Poetry. It really is dense, saturated with poetic imagery all over the place. There's very little literalism in the Bible. You know, from the lesson of the mustard seed to just the very simple idea of just being a shepherd and a flock, like the shepherd flock concept too. The Lord is my shepherd. I mean, the Lord is not literally your shepherd. It's not a literal dude with a garb and a big stick walking around. You know, but the concept is super important to really get a visceral meaning that sets the tone of a relationship on a certain approximation. And it's all full of this really, really inspired stuff.
Oh, yeah. And I'm a gardener. And so working in the soil and with plants, I mean, that is just the richest metaphors.
Yeah.
It's amazing. But I also, I mean, yeah, I am a Christian, and I think very biblically, because that's where I was looking for truth and healing. But I am also not narrow-minded. God has spoken throughout the earth and throughout all cultures. So
Yeah.
I'm not a fundamentalist, I think.
Well, it even says, I think it's Paul who says, right? Or is it Peter? I'm forgetting now, but
No, it
the
was
truth
Paul.
is
You're
written
right.
the truth is written on the hearts of all men. But what he's recounting, yeah, Christ's message that the truth is written on the hearts of all men. Help me out. Which book is this in?
That was Paul.
That was
I
Paul,
wouldn't know
right?
what book.
Okay. Yeah, and I mean, it's the good is the good. It's we're made in the image of God, and so of course God's imprint would be on all of our souls. And somebody from a different part of the world would might use different metaphors and have different associations and images that they've put to wrapping their mind around those truths embedded in their soul. But you know, if you're led by your conscience and your reasoning, you're trying to make the world better in the course of your life, then you will have certain common traits that you will recognize in good Christians and good Muslims who are motivated by the same thing, that you will find as something you can work with and be friends with and trust, versus people who don't have that but call themselves Muslim or Buddhist or Christian or whatever, and they don't have any of those moral attributes. Find similar problems. They might all work together and stand around with Pope Francis on Mount Sinai at COP27 and come up with the new 10 Commandments, how to become stewards for Gaia. But it really won't. It won't be anything very good. I know, Declan, you've been sharing a lot of stuff. Well, it's okay. You found different definitions for metaphor and an analogy.
I also found an article about how they're trying to develop computers that can identify metaphors and stuff like that,
Ah,
and how hard that is.
It's a short enough article. I just read it.
Yeah.
Is it? You just read it. Is it good? Do you think
Yeah.
that it's
Yeah, yeah.
is it something doable?
On the basis of the article, I'd have to say that the people involved in it think it is.
Okay.
I mean, they're
Because
working
I
on
know,
it. Yeah, they're
because
working
I,
on it actively.
yeah, okay. Because I know that computers can compose a text which are quite complex. Uh, but composing texts which are quite complex and composing poetry, for me, it's not the same thing. Okay,
No,
because the
no,
poetry
no, yeah, yeah.
can be 4 lines long and could be much more complex than a 300 pages of text. It
Look,
depends.
if I read it correctly, the main thrust of the article is that using the same kind of algorithms that we might use to understand metaphor can be introduced into computer language in such a way that it helps with figurative language.
That's saying we think like algorithms.
Yeah, I mean, I think the example
exactly.
given
That's their presumption. Now, do we actually think like algorithms? Is that actually what humans do? Is think with like algorithms or not?
Well, that is precisely my contention. Okay, it's possible for us to think like algorithm. Okay, and it's the level of the intellect. Okay, when I memorize things, when I organize things in my mind, there is a classification, and that classification can be called an algorithm. But it's not the only level of the human mind. Okay, that level of human mind, I'm absolutely sure that we can reproduce it in machines.
Mm-hmm.
But it just can't be creative, can it?
Well, what do you mean by creative? Because after all, there is a computer which creates which produces a kind of painting coming from a kind of, for me, of combination of composition. If you accept composition as a level of creativity to a certain degree, but would that computer be capable to solve the apparent contradictions of the movement of the planets, like Kepler has done? Okay, that would be another level of creativity.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's like I've said a couple of times, most of what you guys are talking about feels like it's just so far over my head. But just my instinct is kind of like what we were talking about earlier. Isn't it just linear? The algorithms aren't, well, no, they're not linear. They're
Yeah, go
You
on.
can have very
geometric.
complex. You can have very complex algorithms.
But it can't have a soul.
But well, Susan, you would have to find the essential core quality of a soul. that a machine would not have.
I don't think you can quantify that.
Well, it's life. It's the essence of life. I mean,
Yes.
Yep.
There's something different about us when we're alive and when we're dead. And when you break a computer apart, when you smash it, it's basically still what it was. It's just not working now. And it's just not working right at the moment. But there's something more than just your body not working right when you're dead. There's something that's left, and that's your soul.
Yeah, and when you think about that soul being light or the human spirit being light, I mean, that actually is a piece of God Himself. People talk about that divine spark. And I don't see how you could possibly put that into a computer.
You couldn't.
We can put facets of our
Because
mind
God
into
has
the
to do it.
computer, but God didn't. So I
Exactly.
think it would just crash.
The best we can do is to put an analogy into the computer. I'm being facetious, never mind.
Yes. What you could do is you could boil down all the data from basically all of human history. Conceivably, you could do that, and then you would have something that could produce something, but it couldn't do anything new. So it's like you can make a chess computer that can beat your Gary Kasparov, but what Gary Kasparov can do is he can create new moves in chess. He can create a new way to play the game, and the computer can't. It can just do all the moves that have ever been made.
Well, it could probably also do every move that could be made. Couldn't? Oh, I see what you mean, like strategy moves. You don't just mean like individual moves on the board, like strategies.
Well, theoretically, a computer can make all the needed calculations to have all the move. I think that what is different from the human mind, that we can have warm homes in the human mind, meaning that we can jump from one solution to the other because precisely thanks to the metaphoric process, we can make rapprochements that are not necessarily algorithmic or linear, if you want. Because nowadays we know even computers, the Chinese game of Wei Qi that is better known as Go in the West, has always been seen as a kind of unreachable goal for machines. Okay, well, not true, but because the machine are more and more capable to make fast calculations, but they cannot escape the calculations. Okay, their superiority comes from their speed. But in our case, we are truly poor creatures in terms of mental speed. But what saves us is precisely those mind warm homes, making us escape from the calculation process, that we can jump from one thing to the other by making metaphorical rapprochement.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of something you said, Matt, on way back when you were on Grand Theft World a few months ago. You talked about education and how in the education system they teach kids like computers. And so when they're presented with, well, a computer can do what you can do, and they can do it 10, 100,000 times faster than you. So why do we need you? The kids are like, well, yeah, shoot. I guess I'm worthless. I guess the computer's better than me because that's all they know.
Yeah, that's a big demoralization when you're young, eh?
Resistance is futile.
Yeah, it really is that. That's exactly what I was thinking. The Borg just sucking you in. Yeah,
well,
exactly.
when you grab them that young, that's somewhat true, isn't it? Resistance is futile.
Well, yeah, before they could develop a resistance or an appreciation for the power of their own mind, because it's like when you really get a kid who makes a discovery and they're developing a self-respect and dignity because they're excited, they're overjoyed that they just figured something out, which involves them developing a respect for their own minds. And as soon as they have that dignity, then they can see that, okay, you're trying to lower me to something that I'm not, or you're trying to intimidate me into something that is unfitting for somebody as special as me who can do these things that I know that I have done. But if the kid never is given these experiences, yeah, they're totally susceptible to all sorts of just ugly intimidation and just, you're a cancer. Of course you're a cancer. Look how fast these cancer cells multiply exponentially, and only cancer cells multiply that except for human beings who also replicate at these rates. So we must be cancer cells, kids. You didn't know that? We're just cancer. What do you do when you get a cancer? Well, we have to heal Gaia, don't we? Glazed over eyes.
Yeah. But precisely, it's part of sovereignty then to be capable to say my value is defined by me and not by a system or by someone else.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, because as I said, we are very poor creatures if you take speed as a criterion of value.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, compared to the machines, that's for sure. But it's precisely human sovereignty than to say that I don't accept that criterion of assessment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
It comes down to the distinction between quantity and quality.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because I'm just thinking speed is not all it's cracked up to be.
Yeah.
Because so much, if you rush through it, you miss half of what you could have learned and experienced along the way.
And it might not be as fast as everyone thinks anyway. I mean, I'm sure you've are aware of a guy named Cliff High, most of you.
I know him, yeah.
Okay, Cliff High did an interview on Forum Borealis some years ago. I think it was a series of 3 2-hour interviews or whatever, where he was talking about AI and its origins, etc. Now, he began his life in coding and everything like that right at the start of the computer age, so he was in on the ground floor. And Cliff went out of his way to point out that the foundations of so many coded systems that are still in operation today are built on really poor early coding practices that are still serving as the foundation to a lot of what's been built on top.
Yes.
So artificial intelligence might not be all that intelligent. It might not be as full on as people suggest, that there are inherent flaws in there. As Cliff says, it's simply a case of garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah, sure, exactly.
Well, I think here, Paul, I am very grateful for what you just said, because it's our fault, okay? We should not name those machine artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
We should name those machine intellectual machine or robot or computers, okay? Because computers, of course, come from computer, which is an own word for calculations, okay? So it's a calculating machine. Probably computer is the best word in English.
Well, even the process of the singularity, where supposedly such computers are going to become self-aware. Self-aware of what? Self-aware of a kind of intelligence that's never been known to humans before anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, there's always that potential, but, or that possibility. You can't write it out of the equation, is what I'm saying. But is it likely? No.
You can actually rule out certain types of things. Like it's possible to do that. For example, anybody who says you can use infinite having to get from point A to point B, that they will never get there. To go from point A to point B and just always subdividing that length, that will never work. You will never get that. Or doubling the square. If anybody says that they could do that by simply extending the sides of the square, and they will somehow get the result of the doubling of the surface area of the square, they will never be able to get that. It is an ontological impossibility to acquire the answer to that problem through those methods of thinking. So there are certain types of things you could say are absolute impossibilities that are more than just like, probably we can, but maybe we could. It's like, no, you actually can't do it for certain things.
Can a computer write a poem?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Sure,
yes,
certainly.
Make things rhyme.
Yeah, it can make a rhyming poem as well. It could use.
Oh no, I mean like
symbolism.
a quality poem.
Well, it depends. I would like to suppose one day you have positronic robots. Let's be like Isaac Asimov. Okay, Isaac Asimov said that one day we would have positronic robots, and they wouldn't be practically like humans. But I think here it's not the question of performance. Here the question is the, uh, it's a question of dignity. Okay, and dignity is, are you capable to say that I don't accept that criterion of assessment? And if you are capable of that, you don't need to compare what would be capable a machine, a very sophisticated one. Because I believe very much in the how can I say it? Uh, in
You
the
believe in your
occurrence.
self-confidence.
Well, that is precisely agape. Okay, that's the aristocratic man. Okay, because one day we will have very sophisticated robots. Okay, I predict it in advance. But the, because those very sophisticated robots would be capable to perform at a very high level, does it mean that you don't have a value anymore as a human being? Okay, that is the true test for me. Okay, and the people having enough confidence and cojones to say I still have value, it's because they are aristocratic man, meaning that they have experience agape, that joy coming from creativity and discovery.
Sure.
And it doesn't have to do with speed or with to perform according to certain technical criteria.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, I
And
definitely think this question of the ontological paradox is big. And I know on the issue of quantity over quality, sorry, quality over quantity, a big difference. Um, the issue of Kepler is interesting because he's a guy who had really bad eyesight. Like he was useless for practical astronomy. He was not, he couldn't do it. His eyes were so bad. So in that sense, people who had much better vision, like Tycho Brahe or I mean, there were so many others who could see better. They could use their senses, chart the stars, chart the planets, you know, with the backdrop of the fixed stars much better than him. They had better data, but with all of their data, they were not capable of seeing the paradoxes built into the systems that they were beholden to, that they were working with, and that they were fitting their data into to explain the motions of the planets, you know, whether the sun was moving around the earth or whether things, there were so many different possible configurations. And they all kind of fit the data pretty well. So nobody could really say which model was more or less true, whether Ptolemy or Copernicus or Tycho Brahe. They all had like novel, unique things, but they shared common flaws, all the same. And so none of them really had any claim to being truth. Whereas Kepler, who had bad eyesight, had a better quality of mind through his having internalized Plato's method. He was a Platonist and he was a Pythagorean. And so he was able to then do what they couldn't do, which was to recognize the absurdity of certain unquestioned assumptions that they all shared. And that's what like Quan was alluding to, that they all had different variants of these imaginary mathematical fictions that they all created to make their formulas work, like these epicycles or these equants. And they all,
yeah,
just by
exactly.
doing that, it made it kind of work, but it created this absurd, very, very irrational machine that you have to assume God created. And it's like, why would God create such an unnecessarily complicated machine, which still which still didn't quite fit exactly? You couldn't, no matter how good you got your observations, you couldn't make it fit exactly. And Kepler was able to just force it and push it to its limit. And he created a system that was better than everybody else. And he could have like retired rich. It was so good. And he said, no, I made it this perfect so that so that nobody could say that this paradox doesn't exist. and no matter what, this little 8 minutes of arc couldn't be ignored. It couldn't be accounted for. And so he was able to then just overthrow the entire system of everything that had ever existed in standard models and introduce a new idea based on musicality. And it's like, what type of music makes no sound? Right? Because you can't hear the planets, you can't hear space. But it was like, no, it's very musical. It's all based on a symphony, but it's a symphony without sound. It's paradox, right there. But that concept was everything, and it made everything else work, and everything else fell into place. And that's the idea of gravity in its organic sense that Kepler created it, was a harmony, a coherence of parts in a song, which would have dissonances. And he even had a place for the dissonances, which was it became known as the asteroid belt Ceres, or it was Ceres being the biggest asteroid of the asteroid belt that was discovered like 200 years after he died. But it was there. He knew that was where it was going to be found, and he talked about that because that's where you have a dissonance within the system. So it's perfect. I mean, it's just
But Matt,
it's the belt between Mars and Jupiter, right?
Yeah, exact. The belt of Kuiper.
No, not the Kuiper belt. That's further out. That's another belt.
Further out, yes.
There's another one after Mars. Yeah.
The belt of asteroids.
Yeah. There's two.
But what I wanted to say,
precisely.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, I've just been curious about the whole thing about Kepler and his music of the planets. Does Gustav Holst's thing, the planets, have anything to do with that? Was there any connection?
Gustav Holst?
Yeah,
Holst.
The symphony. The symphony.
The symphony.
Oh,
the planets.
Yeah, probably. But
I gotta listen to it. Is it good?
It's really good. It is very good. Especially Jupiter. Jupiter's the best.
Yeah. Okay.
Who wrote that?
Gustav Holst.
Who is the Italian guy from the 1500s? He wrote something.
1500.
Like the Four Seasons. He wrote.
Oh no! That's the 18th century. That's Vivaldi.
Oh, I thought he was earlier.
No. Well,
early 18th century.
He has But what Matt said about the Keplerian thinking, it's the perfect illustration of a metaphor. Okay, he makes the rapprochement between the harmony in music and the harmony of the planetary movement. Okay, so that it was the opening space of his mind, getting out of the rut of the intellect who were used with the Ptolemaic epicycles.
Mm-hmm.
And it was possible to refine those epicycles to eternity if you want, but it would make something very, very heavy and uselessly complicated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because every time you added more epicycles, it became a little bit better in terms of its ability to approximate the actual observational data, but it would always just miss it. It would just be like asymptotically always getting closer with never hitting the mark.
Well, it's always at the level of sense perception and intellect, and it can be solved at that level, but the solution is quite ugly to see. So beauty as general principle. If you take beauty as general principle, you would say, well, that's a possible solution, but it's not the ultimate solution because it's not beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I just want to say that your ears may not be able to hear that song, but if you are at all becoming the aristocratic man, your heart hears that song, and your heart resonates that song and sings it back. And that is how you quote Heal Gaia. I do believe that we are called to restore creation because it has been ravaged by people that were not good stewards. But when we live with creation and when we learn to hear its song, that song feeds our heart, and then our heart feeds it as well. And that is the song that is coming into tune now. You all amaze me.
I think your key word there is stewards.
Oh, yeah.
Mm.
No, it's there. No, I think you're definitely right. I mean, it's there's an artificial opposition that's been created between science, technology, industry, and nature, and I think that that's such a it's such a shame that this opposition was artificially created because it shouldn't be there. Like industry itself is the consequence. What, like, are you going to say that it's not natural to have industry? Well, many people would say that, but it's like, well, what allowed industry to happen? Well, it required discoveries of laws of nature, right? Are those laws of nature not natural? Well, no, that's a paradox. So, or that's self-contradictory. Of course, the laws are. So is the discovery unnatural? Well, no. I mean, the discovery is a very natural thing. That's discoveries make us happy. Was transmitting it and finding ways of using that knowledge of nature to make life better or more productive. Was that unnatural? Well, somebody who's really brainwashed would say, yeah, but I mean, if you think about it, no, it's the most natural thing we could do. It allows us
So
to,
that's the breaking out of your limits to growth.
well, yeah,
You just do not let the oligarchs and Monsanto take over the discoveries and corrupt them.
right. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, should be simple, but
I love you guys.
we love you too, Susie.
Yeah, I love you too.
I feel like I'm in kindergarten and y'all are in college, but my heart sings with what you all are saying.
Yeah, well,
That's cool.
fitting.
Well, that's good. I'm looking forward to listening to Declan's AI YouTube rap. I'm going to check that out tonight before I go to bed. I also I included in the chat. I hope people have a chance to download the unexpressed poem by Paul Laurence Dunbar. It's a short poem, maybe only 16 verses long. I think it's great, but there's an ambiguity. And maybe next week, I'd like to hear people give me their thoughts of what they think he's saying. I have a hypothesis of what he's talking about. What is this unexpressed thing inside his heart, which aches with the repression? But I don't know if that's true. So I'm curious to hear what other people think that might be. And a longer thing that touches on the question of truth and beauty. And the heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are yet sweeter still, is Percy Shelley's Ode on a Grecian Urn. So if anyone's not read Ode on a Grecian Urn, definitely check that one out and think about what he might be talking about. It's dense with really brilliant metaphor. I don't know, it's just so good. So yeah, those are definitely to be looked at this week. Ode on a Grecian Urn, Unexpressed by Dunbar, and listen to some Bach while you're at it. And we'll touch back next week, guys. And I think this Sunday we have Alex Krainer. It'll be a bit more of a geopolitical, geoeconomic presentation. So that should be good on at 2 p.m. Sunday. And then we'll go on for reading number 6 on Wednesday next. So with that, I bid you all adieu. Thank you all.
Good night, all.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night, all.
Bye.
Catch you next
See you
time.
guys.
Ciao.